Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back in front of you. Giancarlo and I were kidding one another how each other is such a hard act to follow. I think I have the much tougher job, quite frankly. Well, today we are going to delve into what is by far the most important instrument to the orchestra. And you know, this is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of sheer numbers. When you look at the size of the orchestra and all of its instruments, the vast majority are string instruments. And the origins of the orchestra began with the string instrument. And most of our great composers have chosen the string instrument as their muse, their focus. Many great composers began as violinists or cellists themselves. So today, you're going to find out a lot about the heart of the orchestra's instruments, the string section. And we have a very special guest who's going to perform on the violin for you. And we're also going to get a lot of opportunity for you to touch and put a violin in your hands. I actually have a row of 5 violins sitting here, different sizes ones. So for those of you who think your hands are too small for a violin, I have actually a quarter-size violin, I have a half-size violin. There's an 1/8-size violin, Fred tells me. Now that's so small I could tuck it under my arm. Now what are the origins of string instruments? They've been around as old as music and song is. If we think about the origin of string instrument, we really actually can think about our own bodies and our vocal cords. Our vocal cords are in many ways the original string instrument. As you know, our vocal cords are a sheath, a series of muscles, that when we strike them with our breath, they vibrate. And that is how we make sound as human beings. When we tighten our vocal cords, and we know how to do that, we learn how to, as children, to express ourselves emotionally. We learn vocabulary and language, and we associate pitch, how high or low a sound is, with an actual physical function of our vocal cords. And you know, I'm always surprised, for instance, I knew a very, very large man once. I mean, he was enormous, 6'8". You know, he was a professional athlete, and he would always shock everyone when he walked into a room. He would open his mouth, and he would talk like this. Because we know that larger things are lower in sound and lower in pitch. And there are physical, acoustic reasons for such. And we'll talk about them, but you may remember from when I was here a couple of weeks ago, I showed you one of my favorite little toys, and I'm going to review it with you for a second. This is a flexitone, but it well illustrates the way string instruments function and how they have either high or low sounds. This is a piece of flexible steel on a frame of aluminum with a little wooden mallet. And and you can actually see, this is in a way an illustration of our own vocal cords. And so when I tighten it by pressing my thumb, and you can literally see the curve, right? The curve is, it's tense and tighter. It is going to have its highest sound. When something is tense, and if you all just hold up your right hand and clench your fist, just for a second, just do that for me, and relax it. Tense it again, and relax it. That is the way string instruments, as well as our vocal cords, work. So I am tensing this up right now, and it's going to produce a very high sound. I'm going to loosen it up. Wow. Tighten it, loosen it. Tighten it, loosen it. So all string instruments are working on that principle, but there are a couple of other things too. Now, probably the first string instrument after our vocal cords, because many of original instruments were typically things made right from natural materials without much construction. So one of the first string instruments was literally a hole in the ground with a piece of animal gut stretched between two posts. And that animal gut or string could be plucked as part of a musical expression. Now that, of course, developed over time. That hole in the ground, that served really like our body serves to project the sound of an instrument. You know, one of the things that a violin and all string instruments have is they have this F hole. You see that? It's the hole in the front piece of the violin. It's called an F hole because it looks like an F. Now, if we didn't have those F holes, it would be like it's the open mouth of the body of the violin. It allows the vibration when we strike the string to be heard by you. These holes allow that vibration to project outside into the room. It's why a guitar typically has that big round hole in the center beneath the strings, for the very same reason, and it's why we were blessed with our mouth. Not just to speak, but to actually project our sound, our emotion, our vocabulary. Now, string instruments developed over time as people, different societies explored different materials. So things like gourds, which were very important, which are like squashes or pumpkins. And you know what gourds are, and I bet some of you have even dried out a gourd in the fall season and let the seeds dry out and actually had a natural shaker instrument. Well, gourds have been, for many centuries, been cut open or have been hollowed out with the sound, and strings have been laid across that hole. That was an early sound vessel for string instruments. And when you look at the history of string instruments, over time and in different societies, it's not like one society invented the string instrument. It's just that different cultures and societies had different materials, different natural resources. So for instance, you will see string instruments made out of armadillo shells. But you will not see a string instrument made out of an armadillo shell in a culture that doesn't have armadillos. Yes? So musical instruments develop based upon both our absolute human need to create sound as a reflection of the temple of our own body. And they evolved over time as we experimented with greater and greater vessels to project the sound. And then, of course, through time, we began to find better materials to make our strings out of. Even when I first played the classical guitar strings were still made out of catgut. That is very rare today. It is not, I think, morally accepted in music. And I think as an acoustic principle, there is far better sound makers than animal gut. And what have we moved to? Well, we've moved to various different combinations of the kind of technology of plastics and wound different types of brasses and metals. And as technology has evolved and engineering has evolved, so have instruments. But there are certain instruments that have really remained in many ways the same. Now, what makes the violin different than our other instruments? Well, the construction of it. Let's just look at, let me pick out this larger one. First thing we can see about the violin, and by the way, I really grew up appreciating Jack Benny. That's my kind of player of a violin. My mother was very disappointed I did not study the violin. But violins have some basic parts to them. Now we know, and very importantly, that the strings are pulled tight between two ends. That's a dynamic and essential principle of a string instrument. So the point on this side of the instrument, this is called the bridge. And it sort of looks like a bridge, doesn't it? If you think about a span and how bridges will have a high point of which the span or the cables of the bridge are suspended, it's the same thing on the bridge of the violin. And that is one part of where the tension is held between, and then up here is where these turning machines, which tighten and loosen the string to get it to its appropriate pitch. So. Now, this is an instrument actually we use to demonstrate the violin to children and families, and you're going to get a chance to touch these instruments in a second. Now, these instruments also have a number of other basic parts to them. Beside the turning screws or machines in the bridge, this is called a scroll, for obvious reasons, right? And virtually every string instrument has them. The string instrument family also, and the violin in particular, has a typical length of string. And as we talk about the viola and the cello and the bass, you could naturally figure out, can't you, that the shortest strings of all these instruments are going to be on the violin. And the standard length of a violin is 13 inches. For a double bass, and by the way, this is a half-size double bass. I have a much bigger one at home. This is more for kids, though I do have it up on a stand. The standard length of string for the double bass is 42 inches. So it's essentially more than 3 times the length of the string. And you can see there's a great deal of difference in the size, but in the construction, they're pretty much alike, aren't they? They're just kind of like Papa Bear and Baby Bear. Though you would never say that to a violinist, would you? Because, you know, the violin is really the heart of the orchestra, and the greatest musicians, really, in the world often are violinists. Rarely are they double bassists. Though I would recommend, if you are interested in the double bass, there have been terrific double bass players. And today, you can actually find wonderful recordings by double bassists who are creating solo records of magnificent, magnificent work. Now, part of that began in jazz music, where terrific double bass players like Charlie Mingus and others developed a virtuosity that was unseen. But now we have people, for instance, like Edgar Meyer, who lives right here in Nashville. Double bassist for the New York Philharmonic and has done a lot of work with fiddle players. He has many virtuosic records. And then there's a fellow named Bertram Turetsky, who was the first to make solo bass records that sound literally like cellos and violins. So the double bass may not be the most respected of the 4, but it really is as musical an instrument as the others. Now, what else about the violin? Well, what is it made out of? Well, it's made obviously out of woods. The belly, the bass bar, and the sound post. The sound post is a post that's inside of the construction, and it's literally a post. It's like a round dowel. They are typically made of spruce. But other parts of the violin are made out of other kinds of woods. The back is typically maple. Now, why are these woods chosen? over other woods? Well, woods have different densities. They have different abilities to project sound, have different qualities of sound. Remember, if you were here for my first class, when I played a 12-string guitar, the entire instrument, the neck and the entire back of that instrument was made out of rosewood, which is a hardwood known for its ability to create a very bright and sustainable sound. Now, on a violin, violins will have hardwoods too, but not on the back, because this will typically be metal. It will be in the soundboard. Along here, the fingerboard, and often the peg box and the nuts are made out of ebony or some other kind of hardwood. Now remember the difference between hardwoods and softwoods. Those of you who, I'm sure many of you know, those of you who have had fireplaces or chopped wood over time, know that a hardwood burns very differently. Like if you have an oak log, it's going to burn very differently than a pine log, isn't it? The pine log will burn up very fast. It has a lot of resin. It will not create a lot of coals and a lot of heat, but it will come up fast. Where hardwoods, because they're very dense molecularly, they are used often to create the more sustainable sounds in instruments. And then finally, often in a violin, rosewood will be used in a violin, another hardwood, either for the pegs or the buttons. Parts of the instrument that need to be more durable. Now the bow, I have a number of bows sitting around here. Well, you all know what the bow is made out of. This is horsehair. And to this day, whenever I see a musician say that in front of a group of children, they all go, oh. And the musician always has to say, but the horse didn't get hurt. It doesn't hurt a horse to cut its tail. It really doesn't. But it's very important because the horsehair combined with something called rosin, which a string player will typically put on the surface of the bow, is what creates the friction in order to enable the string to vibrate. Now we know, and we're going to have Kelsey explain the violin in great detail, but we know that the instrument can be played by plucking it, often called a pizz or pizzicato, or it can be played with a bow. And it's a very, very different sound. But played with a bow, we want maximum friction. So between the horsehair and the rosin, we can get that. Now, before I go any further, you really need to hear a great player on this instrument. And Kelsey, would you come forward? I want to introduce Kelsey. Kelsey Hudson is a student at the Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt University in violin. And she is also a student of psychology, which I think is a wonderful combination. You know, I think the great musicians of the 21st century are going to be multi-skilled like she is. And also, Kelsey's particular musical interest is Baroque music. You know, the earlier stage of the classical, or actually pre-classical form. And is your mic working, Kelsey? Let's hear it. Yes. It is? Can you hear her? No, well, I may need to stand up here with you because we're not sure. Let me check. Is there a sound button on here? Well, you know what? We're going to just work together. Aren't I lucky? So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your instrument to begin with?
My instrument is a klotz. It was made in Germany in 1734. And I got it when I was 12, so 10 years ago. You'll have to excuse me, I'm getting over the flu, so I have sort of a soft voice. It's very, very old. You can see the woodwork on the back is very beautiful. It has older violins have a more curved belly, like Mitchell was talking about, than newer violins. And it has a very mellow sound because it's so old. It's been played by many different people.
Great. Well, let's hear this wonderful instrument.
I'm going to play sort of a slow fiddle type of piece, so you can get to know some of the slower sounds in the middle range of pitch, sort of, we're comparing it to a voice, sort of a normal speaking tone, not too high and not too low. And in terms of how I'll be using the bow, I'll be using some slower bows so that it will create more of a sustained sound.
That's lovely. A wonderful player. Kelsey, tell me a little bit about musicians, all of us. We choose our instruments often because there's something about it that affects us. And what about this instrument? Why did it become so central in your life?
I actually chose the violin because I was in a musical, The Sound of Music, when I was 5 years old, and I really loved the pit orchestra that accompanied the musical, and I really enjoyed the violin because it seemed at that time such a small instrument could make such a compelling sound, and now that I'm older, I feel quite similarly in that the violin, although it is a string instrument, can often sound like a voice and can evoke incredible emotions from audiences and also can reach a variety of people. It doesn't need to be just classical music or just fiddle music, but can often affect an incredible amount of people through a variety of musical ways.
You have told us and told me, and I shared it with our audience, that Baroque music has become your real musical love. Now, one of the things we know about Baroque music is that the instruments were somewhat different.
Yes.
And so was the music. And why don't you talk a little bit about that for our audience?
Okay. Well, this is my modern instrument, and I don't have my Baroque violin with me today, but some of the main differences are that, unfortunately, not according to what you said, some of us still do use gut strings on the instruments.
In Baroque instruments,
Yes.
because they were made that way,
Yes,
correct?
exactly.
Good.
And part of Baroque music these days is trying to be very historically accurate. So part of what I'm interested in is playing Baroque music, which is music from the 16, 17, and sometimes 1800s, in a way that represents how it would have been played back in that day, which is why we still use gut strings. And in that sense, people these days are trying to represent almost historically accurately what was played back in those days. So some of the main differences are the strings. The violin looks much different than the modern violin. It has a lower bridge so that people could play the strings more easily. It wasn't as curved, it was more flat. The bow is very different. It's a much more simple look, and Some of them don't even have the same type of screws or hair that we have now. So it's a little bit more of a simple way of playing than the modern violin.
And you know, the music that she's studying cares so much about Baroque music. Not only did it have this difference of instruments, it of course had a different way of playing that you were beginning to indicate. I mean, first of all, the instruments were not as loud. It was meant to be a much more intimate kind of music, smaller audiences, yes, smaller rooms. But also, I think one of the most amazing thing about dedicated players of Baroque music is that you really study the intent of the composers. And you look to understand their notes and their markings in order to portray the music as accurately possible in the time it was written. So in many ways, you're invoking the great history of this instrument.
Yes, exactly.
It must feel really good to do that.
It feels great.
Yeah. Now, the other thing about the violin is we're used to it being a voice, a single voice, the most powerful voice that can float above 100 other instruments. But the violin can do a couple of other things, as we've mentioned. Now, there's other ways to play it besides the bow. Could you demonstrate some pizzicato for us, and maybe even a Bartok pizz, if you could?
Okay, the difference between a regular pizzicato and a Bartok pizz is that a regular pizzicato is plucked with the meaty part of your finger, so it's sort of it can be a harsher sound, but it's usually quite gentle. And a Bartok pizz is plucked actually with your first finger and your thumb, so it's a very vertical motion, and sometimes you can even use your nail. It creates a very harsh, striking sort of sound. So first I'll demonstrate a regular pizz. And this is a Bartok pizz.
One of the other, of course, things about the violin is it is not just playing single notes. Violinists work on chords. And would you just show us a little bit about how you will, chord, and maybe an excerpt that exemplifies that?
I can actually play some of the same piece that I was playing before with more than one note, which is called a double stop, because usually it's two notes. And so I can play some of that, and then after I can play a 4-note chord, which is usually used in pieces, in a lot of Baroque pieces actually, to make a very full sound, since sometimes the violin plays by itself, and since there's no accompaniment, 4-note chords, or 2 to 4 notes played at one time, are used to sort of create an accompaniment feel. Next, I'll play a 4-note chord, and you can see how that's a much more full kind of sound.
Give Kelsey a hand. Kelsey's going to stay with us a little bit longer, and at the end of our program, we'll get a chance to hear her play something else. I'm just checking on our time. We're doing very well here. That's very good. Well, now it's time for you to get some violins in your hands. Now, this is not a mandatory part of our class. This is only if you want to. Now, I have some volunteers. I'm so grateful for our volunteers who help us often at the Nashville Symphony. Thank you so much for being here, guys. And if you would, if you take your weaponry, you want to take one of the smaller ones, don't you, Fred? And we're going to go up and down both sides of the aisles, and we're going to just have a play period right now. Now, if you don't want to play them, watch your neighbors and see how their hands adjust to them, how sound is made. Don't worry about dropping them. Don't worry about banging them. I mean, yes, you'll be careful with them, but don't be afraid, right? You're not going to be afraid, right? No, not at all. I'll get you a bow, too.
This is an 8 size.
Why did I pick out you? You're probably wondering, Tom, but I just thought you were the man. Well, good. Tom just told me he's never touched one before, which I think is the whole idea of this, don't you? Yes, the little tiny ones, like the 8th size one that Fred has, were developed originally for Suzuki violin, for little children. Well, you know, Suzuki was a great Japanese music educator who felt that the youngest of children should have the opportunity from ages 4 and 5 and 6 to play the violin. Now, Suzuki violin, of which that 8th size violin is an example of, actually, when a child studies Suzuki violin, their parent studies beside them. One of the parents or guardians actually studies the violin too, so that the parent can be a home teacher between lessons. It's a really wonderful kind of approach to the violin. And there are special songs that are created for young children to play in unison. Here we go.
Yes. Now I'm going to go up back. And
Please.
Say something about the difference between the variation in the length of the bow.
Yes.
How you do that?
There's questions about the variations in the length of the bow. Well, one of the reasons why bows will be shorter and longer is the size of the instrument. I mean, a standard bow for the double bass will be typically larger. It's also a matter of preference and history. The bow developed over time too, as Kelsey was telling us. The original Baroque bow didn't have usually the end nut. It was a much simpler kind of bow, but over time, the technology of the actual making of the bow wood itself, the quality of that wood, the construction, and then of course, as time has gone on, musicians want more and more. They ask builders to add this, curve the bow, add more hair, make it slightly longer. And now we're seeing bows that are even more fit for the natural nature of the hand. So we're seeing certain modern technologies, but I will tell you, of all the string instruments, where we see the most innovation is the viola. And the reason is that the violin, the cello, and the bass are so standardized, but the viola sits really between the violin and the cello, and there's more room for innovation. So you will see in some orchestras violas that have completely different shapes, or violas playing with bows of very different lengths. But it is harder in the very strict world of classical music to make too many changes in a quick time, because the music is written a certain way. We need to obey the composer's wishes, and there's a certain sound we're trying to create. Well, we got to get some fiddles in the back of the room, huh? Let me see here. I got another one here. We do not have a viola here today. I have a cello and a bass, but not a viola.
Here.
Yes.
In the symphony, do all of the violinists play the same size instrument?
In a symphony, do all of the violinists play the same size instrument? Basically, yes. It's a standard size in the violin. So the first violinist and the second violinist, if they held up their instruments, they're going to be relatively the same size. Depending on exactly the year the instrument was built, there may be some variation. But the violin is a standardized instrument with a standard length of string and architecture. Yes?
When you become
I will. You know, one of the best programs that I manage at the Nashville Symphony is called, are you ready for this? Is it a fiddle or violin? That's the name of the program. And we have a great fiddle player and a great violinist appearing on stage together. And what they do is they talk about their styles for a while. The fiddle player talks about, you know, the origins of, you know, Scott-Irish music and Appalachian music and the way that he plays his instrument. And the violinist plays Bach and Mozart and the traditions. And then by the end of the program, they're playing one another's music. They've switched instruments, and they look around to their audience and go, it's the same instrument. It's just a different way of playing the same instrument. And that is really the answer. And we are actually seeing more and more great fiddle players doing concertos with orchestras. And we'll see more and more of that. And in fact, this coming year, or next season, we have Bella Fleck, who is one of the greatest banjo players in the world, doing a concerto with the Nashville Symphony. So it just shows that how music is evolving and how our need to keep the categories separate in music is beginning to break down, because what matters is that it's great music. And so there's very little difference. In fact, it's just the way you approach that instrument. Yes, ma'am.
It looks like a very hard finish on those. Does that not affect these characteristics of the wood that you talk about?
Well, you know, if we compared Kelsey's instrument to this one, this is a pretty cheap instrument. This is really pretty cheap. So the varnish on this, the woods on this, are going to be harsher and brighter. But if we looked at Kelsey's instrument, you see how subtle it is, softer it is. And of course it has all the age, but look, they are essentially the same instrument. Over time, they continue to develop. Now this is from what year again? 1734, that instrument. That's even older than me. So are people getting to touch violins? We haven't had any back here, huh? Ma'am. Sure, what's your question?
When she played chords, do the notes come from her fingers or from the bow? And that's very basic.
Okay, the question is, when Kelsey was playing chords, were the sounds coming from the bow or the strings? The notes. Or the notes? Well, essentially, when she fingers the strings, like any string instrument, the actual sound is caused the second the bow vibrates on the string. When the bow is drawn along the string, that's the sound production. The chording of it is affecting how high or low the sound we hear. But the moment of sound production is the bow, that hair, with the friction of the rosin, rubbing against a string. That's the moment of sound. That is it. Does that answer your question?
So without the bow, the fingers aren't going to make a sound.
That's right. Or plucking. The string has to be in some way vibrated. And that either comes from the plucking, as Kelsey illustrated to us, or the bowing. That's the moment of sound production. Yes, sir.
What characteristics make a Stradivarius so much better than the other one?
Okay, what makes a Stradivarius so much better than most other instruments? Well, there were two great violin makers of that era, Stradivarius and Guarneri. And those instruments are considered to be the greatest ever made because of a number of things. The woods that were made were completely properly chosen, and they were sustainable, meaning they lasted and lasted. And these were master engineers of instrument making. They were true artists of building violins and similar instruments. And so, like anything, they were the highest quality creators of these instruments, and their legend, their reputations were immediate. All the great violinists wanted to play their instruments, and that has continued since those instruments were made. And of course, as Kelsey indicated earlier, these instruments improve their sound over time. Now, for those of you who are interested in the science of acoustics, often an instrument will improve over time because literally the woods are a specific molecular structure. And many acousticians feel like a great concert hall, the molecules of the actual construction of wood begin to line up better. They begin to become more in sequence. And over time, well-made instruments, that aspect improves. The sound becomes more mellow. It becomes richer and deeper. And those specific instruments were the greatest ever made. For the human ear, whether you have a sophisticated musical ear or not, you would be able to tell the difference between a great violin versus a not so great violin. I'm sorry? Where was the first violin made? It's arguable that there were many cultures that made violins. We have found violins in North Africa, in archaeological digs, in the Middle East. Many Middle Eastern cultures had violin-like instruments. It's one of those debatable things that it's hard to say. There's no definitive answer of when the first violin was created. Yes, sir?
Did strings predate percussion?
Great question. Do string instruments predate percussion instruments? Now that there is an answer to, and the answer is no. What is considered by virtually every ethnomusicologist to be the first instrument is the drum. Drums were, remember when I told you about the hole in the ground? And how the hole in the ground was in many ways the first acoustic body to project sound? Well, the first drum were really holes in the ground with animal skin stretched over, or literally naturally created vessels like a tree that has fallen where its innards are hollowed out over time and it becomes like a drum, or a shaker that falls off a tree and that dries out, or a gourd that naturally dries out. So in many ways, the first percussion instruments literally fell from the sky.
What about the whistle?
I'm sorry?
What about the
The
whistle?
whistle and wind instruments, the origin of those instruments are clear as well. Many of the first of all the wind instruments were also naturally found right within people's own environments. So for instance, the conch shell, and various shells. The way those make the sounds is if you just cut off the edge and you access the inner chambers and vibrate your lips like any brass instrument. That was one of the first wind instruments. Bamboo and other reed-like substances. People would literally hear in the night wind blowing through reeds or blowing through trees. So the idea to create a wind instrument using our own breath to blow through a natural vessel came from that kind of experience. Yes, sir?
Will gut strings be more sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity than
Kelsey, I'm going to let Kelsey answer that question, but the answer is yes, isn't it? The question is, are gut strings more sensitive to humidity or temperature changes? And they absolutely are. It's hard to maintain those strings, isn't it? Why don't you talk a little bit about how do you maintain a gut string and what are some of the difficulties of it?
One of the big problems with gut strings actually is the length of time that they stay good to play. So they can unwind very easily. They're wound in a certain way and they sort of unravel and get sort of shriveled up. With these strings, you're supposed to change your strings depending on how much you're playing every 2 to 4 months or so. But with gut strings, they're much more temperamental, and they don't do well with temperature extremes.
Thank you, Kelsey. Meaning that it's one of the another reasons why the technologies developed was to make it easier on string players. I mean, to change your strings really often and to not be able to depend upon them. And music, of course, got more and more demanding on violinists and on the instruments. So it's another reason why so many musicians have moved towards a technology in strings that makes it easier for them to use. Yes, sir. Sure. Kelsey, we're going to have you demonstrate this. He was asking about the high ranges of the violin, and he talked about specifically the ninth position.
Oh, okay.
Well, but why don't you just talk to us, first of all, about the challenges of playing on the high range, up the neck of the violin. Talk to us about it and demonstrate.
Well, there are endless challenges to playing in the high range of the violin, but some of them are physical, so it's not exactly a very natural position to hold a violin. You know, your arm is in sort of an awkward position, and we do try to make it as efficient physically as possible, but how it looks while you're in first position, which just means down here, sort of a natural pose, as opposed to ninth position, which is way up here, it's very physically awkward. So that's one thing, the ease of playing is diminished greatly, and so that means that precision is also diminished greatly. So most practice in pieces that have a lot of high passage work has to be very methodical and repetitive because there's so much room for error, and also because the string is being shortened so much. So when I put my finger way up in this position, the length is only about 4 inches as opposed to 13 or 12 down here. So that means that there's less room to put your fingers, and that can make things out of tune or not sound very good, and so that's why it's a lot harder to play up in the higher positions.
And you know, Kelsey's right that string players spend an awful lot of practice time in the upper positions because it's just where we all mess up. I mean, even when Itzhak Perlman came to do our New Year's Eve concert, as great a player as he is, you could see when his work on the upper ranges was where he had certain intonation challenges. And I mean, he's one of the greatest fiddlers ever. But up in the 8th and 9th position, it's hard for everyone. Ma'am, and then I'll go to you. The question is about sometimes when a violinist is fingering a string, their hands are quivering. Well, that is a very specific technique called vibrato. And actually, we're going to have Kelsey demonstrate vibrato. You can put it back if you want. Sure.
Vibrato is another great example of how the violin or any string instrument can be equated to a voice. So a lot of, like you can compare it to the sound you might hear from a young boys' choir is a very pure sound. There's not much vibrato. It's very, very pure. And you compare that to a sound from an aria in an opera with much vibrato, and it's very striking and it's very bold. That's sort of the difference. So it's not necessary to sustain a sound at all. It has nothing to do with how the bow is on the string or anything, but it's sort of a decorative embellishment, and at this point in time, it's basically a part of playing, and it is always a choice. In some pieces, I don't use vibrato on one note, but it's always a choice, and it's always a choice to use vibrato as well. And the way that Suzuki students learn vibrato is by filling a empty film canister with paper clips and shaking your wrist back and forth in rhythms. So again, with the precise practicing methods, but essentially what you're doing is warming up the sound of a note. So I'll play a note without vibrato, and then I'll play a note with very slow vibrato, and then I'll play a note with very fast vibrato, and you can see the differences.
So that's without vibrato. Just clean in. More vibrato. So you can literally hear the wave of the sound because of the vibrato, the technique, which is a technique you spend many years developing, yes? And there are certain teachers who prefer more vibrato and certain teachers who prefer less. So that's a little bit about our few minutes with the subject of vibrato. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll go to you, sir. And I think I have someone here. Go ahead.
Is the piano a percussion instrument or a string instrument?
Is the piano a percussion or string instrument? Oh, that's a fun one to debate. But essentially, in the end, most of us view it as a hybrid of several instruments. But it is considered in the percussion family largely because all the strings in the innards of the piano they make their sound only in one way. A hammer hits them. There is a percussive action that creates the basic sound of the piano. So most people consider it in the percussion family, but it's completely arguable that it's a string instrument. Yes?
When is the mute used?
The mute in the violin? Yes. Kelsey, you want to talk to us about muting? Or as when my children were young, my youngest daughter, who just is graduating from Smith this year, she's really smart. She used to call it mudding. Mudding. So, muting, Kelsey, tell us a little bit about it.
There are different reasons to use a mute. This is a very small mute, which symphony players use. You might see them putting a mute on. There are also huge mutes called practice mutes that are used specifically for, if you're in a hotel and you don't want to bother other people and you have to tone down your sound a little bit. But basically, it's a rubber mechanism that is placed over the string and put on the bridge so that the vibrations are muted and the sound is not as bright. So I'll play a couple notes without the mute and then with the mute.
Thank you, Kelsey.
And some of the reasons that composers may use a muted passage is to still have the effect of a string instrument, but not the typical effect that you might expect from a string section, so that maybe in a more melancholy piece or a mysterious sound, or even to let another section provide an overarching kind of sound.
Excellent explanation. And the mute is not just for string instruments. We see our brass players using them all the time. It's a very important part. And of course, this is a question I've heard many times. What's the single largest mute in the orchestra? It's the mute for the tuba. It would have to be the single largest instrument, would require the single largest mute. And a mute for a tuba can often be that big around. But it's doing the same thing. The purpose is to quiet the sound, to enable a composer to explore a different balance of sounds. And I thought Kelsey explained it beautifully. There are certain composers who will have muted string sections, for instance, if they want to invoke perhaps the beginning of a sunrise or the quiet of a conversation or something not even so programmatic, a soft or quiet feeling. But mutes become part of the expressiveness of a composer and enable a composer to explore many different parts of instrument sounds. Ma'am?
Could you explain the difference in the strings? Are they a specific note, like a G string?
It's a very good question. Actually, I meant to bring this up before, so thank you. Not only are we talking about the lengths of strings and how tightly they are wound, but another factor is the diameter of a string. The lowest of string instruments will be the thickest in diameter. So for instance, let's see if I can get this here. If I pick up this double bass and we look at the lowest string, the top string, you're going to see how thick the string is compared to the highest sounding one. So that is both the lowest sound because, one, the length, but very importantly, it is a much thicker diameter, which allows its vibration to be slower. Great question. And ma'am, you had a question too.
Mine's about the tuning process in the symphony. You know, the oboe starts and then the strings all tune. And it seems like it has to be done so often. And I guess I'm wondering, why do you choose the oboe to lead everybody else with the tuning? And also, is it the pressing on the strings that makes them go out of tune right away? I know humidity has something to do with it, but if you're at like the skirmer horn, I think the instrument would be used to that humidity to go out.
Well, great questions about the tuning of the orchestra. The tuning of the orchestra really happens from two sources. It happens, you're absolutely correct, from the oboe, but it actually also happens from the first violin. It will be the concertmaster who will tune the strings. And then the oboe will tune everybody else. And we'll make sure everybody else is tuned together. The reason this happens is that it's very easy for a string instrument to, and any reed instrument, to go out of tune. It could be you are walking from the side stage to your seat and you just bump one of your machines. It could be there is a change of temperature that is drastic enough between backstage and stage. Now you're right, at the skirmer horn, we maintain very specific temperatures backstage and in the hall and humidity levels, so we minimize those things. But instruments, anyone will tell you, are very, very delicate creatures. Now, when I played the 12-string guitar in concert, and I did it on the road for 20 years, I traveled with 3 instruments. They were all in different tunings. Now, that's a way of approaching that instrument. And the reason I would travel with 3 instruments rather than 1 is I couldn't take the time on a stage to change the tuning of an instrument. Those of you may remember from my first class, I said I had a regular nightmare about spending an entire concert tuning my instrument. Some instruments are more delicate than others. Factors like the age of strings that Kelsey brought up, the quality of the instrument, and environmental things. You know, I've talked to our reed players and our double reed players, and they will tell you that there are some weeks that no matter what you're doing inside the building, because it's really hot out, or it's really humid out, or there's been a big storm, it makes it very hard to maintain the quality sound they want on their reed. So, you know, instruments, one of the great things about them, as we become more and more digital and technological, is that instruments are like human beings. They have their faults. They are imperfect. And it is imperfection that makes music, to me, so powerful. It's not about making mistakes, but it's the fact that we can make an imperfect instrument sound perfect in a given moment in time is, to me, one of the essences of great performance. When Kelsey picks up her instrument, she knows everything that can go wrong, but she doesn't think about it. She can think about it. She's only thinking about the music, but at the same time, and this was what a lot of our first class was about, being a musician on these instruments is about preparation. You spend, you started at the age of 5. So Kelsey started at the age of 5. So when something goes wrong with her instrument, it maybe, you know, one of the strings goes a little tick off pitch. She's completely capable and prepared. often in the middle of a piece, to nudge it right back to where it needs to be. There are other things that go wrong, but part of it is working with all of these challenges to create the best sound possible under the circumstances. And it really is the great fun, but also the real hard work of being a player. It was a great question. Yeah, let's go back here. Sir, and then I'll get you.
Are the positions of concertmaster and first violin separate? Are they the same?
They're typically the same. It is the same. The question was about the concertmaster and the first violin. It is generally the same position. First violins, though, do refer to the entire section of violins that are playing the higher and typically more melodic line. The concertmaster is the head of the string sections and is really the assistant to the conductor during a concert. Great concertmasters, if you watch them, they are looking at the members in their section. They are nodding at them. They may be furthering the conductor's instructions. Right now, you may know that the Nashville Symphony is in the process of auditioning concertmasters. So if you've been coming to our concerts, you may have noticed different people sitting in that chair. We're having a ball because we're having some of the greatest concertmasters and first violinists come and play with us, and it's been an awful lot of fun. But sometime by the end of this season, Giancarlo will select our next concertmaster, and whatever choice he makes, it's going to be great because all of these players have been mind-blowingly good. I promise you, yes, sir.
Is there any configuration in the string for a left-handed bow?
There can be. You know, instruments can be reconfigured. Musicians, however, are not trained that way. There are players who play from the other side. Just like any instrument, instruments can be reconfigured. Yes, though it's not encouraged. Ma'am.
What percent of musicians or conductors have perfect pitch?
What percentage of musicians have perfect pitch? It's hard to say, but it is not as typical as you would think in musicians. First of all, it is not a requirement for a musician to have a perfect pitch. Kelsey, do you have perfect pitch? No. You're probably pretty happy you don't, right? It's sort of a great big pain. It really is because, you know, if you have perfect pitch, yes, one of the problems is that you hear the slightest intonation changes, and they're not pleasant. And it gets in your way of enjoying the music sometimes. I have to shut that part of me off when I go to concerts, because then I get too involved in everybody trying to create perfect pitch. But it's not what it's about. And it's you know what it is? It's a combination. It's a function of our nervous systems and the way our auditory process works. And most players who do not have perfect pitch, and those who do not, I think, typically become better musicians. Why? Because the small, you know, minuscule intonation issues don't get in the way of their playing. You see what I mean? It's kind of like, what would be a good metaphor? It would be something like, you know, if you're a great rose gardener, you grow roses, right? And you're one of the best there is. And there's a certain point, you know, and I can grow roses too, but I'm not very good at it. And I will enjoy an imperfect rose. I really will. Now I'll cut it, I'll put it on my table in a beautiful vase. But I know people who grow roses. That is the essence of their life. And an imperfect rose is of very little interest to them. You see what I mean? That's probably a poor choice of metaphor, but I tried. What's that?
Along the line of perfect, you
know, and,
Sure.
and players.
Uh-huh.
What's wrong? Josh Bell, or do they make violin players as good as they used to? Because, you know, Josh Bell's so popular, and every album I get, sometimes I'm disappointed. Is it the music he's playing, my ear, or the way players are nowadays?
Well, I'll tell you, if any of you had a chance to hear the Sibelius that we did last weekend, there was a violinist on our stage, 25 years old. That was amazing. I mean, right? Those of you, I mean, weren't you moved beyond tears? He was, to me, he was as good as anything I've ever heard. He was as good as Itzhak was when he was young. He was, to me, there are great violinists coming out, great musicians. But let us remember, we live in a time where marketing is a huge part of music, and there are some musicians that possess certain other qualities who may be marketed, who may not be as great a player as another. And no disrespect to Mr. Bell at all. He's a very fine player. But I would prefer, for instance, to hear the Sibelius played by this young man who played it this past weekend than a Josh Bell.
Can we get that in a CD?
This young man has recorded Sibelius, so you can find his CDs.
What's his name?
His name is Stefan. How do you pronounce the last name? Say that real loud. Jeku. That is exactly it. It's spelled J-A-K-A-I-W. Exactly. Jeku. But a player you should have a recording of. He was wonderful. Ma'am.
Back to tuning instruments. When you play in the parks in the summer, how do they deal with that?
Wow, what a great question. When we play in parks in the summer, how do we deal with it? With a great deal of consternation and complaint. It's very, very hard on our musicians. And we actually have, you may not know, but in events like that, we have certain temperature and humidity barriers that if it is beyond a certain temperature, we don't play. So we do have certain boundaries, but musicians will tell you they are the hardest concerts they have to do. It's very hard to sometimes, depending on whatever instrument it is, it's about accuracy and intonation. You don't hear things as well when you're playing outdoors. The conductor, becomes in certain ways more important, which to some musicians they don't want that to be so. For wind players, double reed players, humidity is a tremendous factor in the effectiveness of the sound. So we do it as a service to the public, but many people would say it is not the same level of service to the music. Yes, sir.
Play a guitar. Guitars have frets. The fret determines the note. How do people without notes, other than just years of practice, hit the string and the note is perfect?
There is no other way except years of practice. I mean, a fretless instrument like the violin or this double bass, there are exact positions on the fingerboard where there is a particular pitch. It's what a string player spends many, many, many years working on. You can't think about it. Your finger has to land there. And it has to land there as accurately as possible. Sometimes you will see the string player make a small adjustment, which is part of playing the instrument. But that is very much the nature of playing this fretless string instrument, it's the position. And it's the accuracy of your hand and hitting that proper space, which is how you hit the right note. It's a great question. When you're in an orchestra, are you hearing your own violin within all the other sounds? Yes. Now remember, and Kelsey, hold up your violin and position it on your shoulder. I mean, look where it is in relationship to her ear. You'd really be in trouble if you couldn't hear your own violin. But there's a good deal of sound, and so much of the squabbling, the sometimes disagreements between musicians who share stands or who sit next to one another. Musicians will say to one another, "You're playing too loud."
Show us the cello.
All right, I'm going to quickly show you this cello that I have hidden somewhere here. Where is it? Oh, yeah, this is a half-size cello. It's no different, is it, than everything we've been doing. Now, of course, the violin and the cello are the two string instruments which have seen the greatest artistry and some of the greatest writing. Now, we know that often the cello, and cellists love to say that the cello is the most like of the human voice. Most like the human voice than any other instrument. But, you know, I will tell you that clarinetists say that. Violinists say it. A lot of people say it. But the flute, exactly. But obviously, what makes a cello very different, it is played both sitting down and it is played, obviously, with the end pin up, and is played between the legs of the player. And the bow is drawn this way. Now, some of the greatest music has been written for the cello. I love cello concertos. You know, I had wanted to play you some music today, but we did not have the CD set up. But I would have at this moment played you, for instance, The Swan, which is a very, very, very famous cello solo, or for instance, Dvorak cello concertos, which are, to me, you know, explore the instrument and its lush sound so very well. I just want to check on our time, see how we're doing here. We're right there, aren't we? Wow, you see how much time passes when we're having fun?
Tell them to bring their grandchildren to the next Pied Piper concert.
I have a suggestion here to recommend for you all to bring your grandchildren to our Pied Piper concerts. The next Pied Piper concert, I'm not sure, it's the 26th of February. Thank you. Boy, I should bring her everywhere I go. February 26th. These are wonderful concerts that are very appropriate for your grandchildren. We see children ages 4 to 10 who really, really enjoy it. And younger, exactly. We see kids on laps and all that. And we have activities before each of these concerts. We have a petting zoo with over 70 instruments, just like you had today, except we have every other instrument which young children can try and experiment. We have all sorts of other activities. And then the concert itself is very accessible to young children. We will often have acting companies, and it will be very story-based. So please check out our Pied Piper concerts. They are wonderful. I'll answer one more question, and please.
Another Pied Piper concert on the 7th of May.
That's right. Thank you so much. Boy. There is another Pied Piper concert this year on May 7th. To conclude our program, please go right ahead.
If you're staying for the lunch and learn, lunch will be served in the fellowship hall, which is due west into this conference.
Thank you. And we're going to have our wonderful violinist conclude our program today. Please thank Kelsey Hudson again for joining us. It's been wonderful. Go ahead. Why don't you? Let me come up here and give you a little bit of my microphone.
I'll be playing a meditation from an opera called the Thais Meditation, and it's about a woman who has followed some difficult paths in her life, And I thought this would be a good piece following the theme of the violin, sometimes evoking emotions or following what an emotional pattern may be like a vocal song. And this piece is about reflection and moving forward.
I think you'll all have to agree with me that the future of music is bright, is it not? Thank you. We'll see you again. It was a great class. Enjoyed it.